Hello everyone and welcome to the class on world history. We have been discussing French Revolution and its causes, but today it is important that you learn what was the main sequence of event which actually is cumulatively known as French Revolution. So, we are going to talk about French Revolution. And when we study French Revolution, we know that the year when it started was 1789 and it continued till 1799, that is 10 years. For your understanding, you can divide the series of consequences or series of events into three important sections, right. So, first important event was obviously when people revolted against the king and the formation of National Assembly, that is the first stage. You can tag it as first stage, and first stage is obviously 1789 to 1793. Then the second stage when the National Convention was formed, and let me just write here the second stage when Jacobins came into power 1793 to 1795, and then the final stage, the third stage. That will be from 1795 to 1799 when the directorates took the power, and in 1799 finally Napoleon came and usurped the power in France and formed an autocratic government or authoritarian regime. So, that ended French Revolution. Because there are so many events that takes place in this revolution, it is important to mark these stages so that you understand what was happening. So, when did the French Revolution actually began? We have read the causes, we have read one of the cause being the financial crisis, and it also saw that farmers didn't have enough income after the American war of independence. When you look into the cause, obviously one of the cause is the financial crisis, and in that crisis when people didn't had enough money, France decided to support America in its war for independence. But right after that, Louis XVI, the King of France, decided to impose new tax on the masses. Now, we had already studied that French society was divided into feudalistic, society into three stages or three stratas. Now, let us look into those stratas. If you remember, the three stratas of French society were feudalistic in nature. There was the first strata which had the nobles, and they controlled all the official jobs, and they also had the right to service from the masses. The second strata was that of clergy, and they had the right to impose certain tax on the people. The clergies also, the church of France also had land holding, and they got service from the people. The last or the third tier or the third estate was the common people, the estate or the class of people which had merchants, peasants, writers, lawyers, the newly educated middle class. Now, the problem was this third estate or the third tier or the third section of the society had the responsibility of paying tax and financially supporting France, but they had no administrative power or no say in the laws which were made by the noble and the king. Now, in such a circumstance, when king decided to impose new tax, obviously the third estate revolted. The first thing that they did was to demand for equal voting right. Now, what had happened? Because King Louis XVI knew that third estate is not ready to pay edit texts, especially because there is there was famine like condition going on. He decided to call an assembly of all the 3 estates. Now, this was an old assembly which was which was inaugurated almost 100 years earlier, and it didn't give any real power to the 3rd estate. The problem was that each state had one vote, but 3rd estate said that since the population of 3rd estate is much larger from the nobles and clergies, 3rd estate should get large number of vote, or the number of vote given to 3rd estate should be equivalent to the population it is representing. Now, earlier Louis XVI accepted this demand and he called the General Assembly. But when these people, the representatives of 3rd estate, went to the assembly, they realized that king was not going to give them any extra added power, or the number of vote coming from 3rd estate was also going to be 1 like any other state. Now, when this meeting was organized, people across France, especially peasants, came to know that Louis XVI is organizing this assembly where all the 3 estates will participate and all the 3 estates will get the right to vote. People also had this opinion that most probably Louis will give added participation or added vote to the 3rd estate. As such, lot of people across France came and they gathered near the palace of Versailles. Now, what had happened at that time? In Paris, when the 3rd estate came to know that such a power was not going to be granted, they were not going to get extra voting right in this assembly, the people who were representing 3rd estate, they boycotted the assembly and they came out of the palace. Okay. Now, all these incidents took place. Now, let me write it down. 10th June 1789. This is an important date because on 10th June the representatives of the assembly came out. The representatives of 3rd estate, they came out of the palace and they formed the National Assembly. Now, this assembly had educated people of France. Now, remember that I had told you that France had also developed, it had also gone through the Renaissance and Enlightenment era. People had, the middle class had educated themselves, and we had journalists, lawyers, doctors, who were part of this middle class. They understood what was the human right, what was the Enlightenment theory, and they also understood that France had participated in American War of Independence to gain republicanism and democracy to America, but same was not granted to the people in France. These educated section were the people who were representing National Assembly. Along with that, there were few enlightened nobles as well from higher strata who thought that France had to undergo certain change. These were the people who formed National Assembly. On 20th June, just after 10 days, a famous incident took place. What was the incident? This is known as Tennis Court Oath. Tennis Court Oath. Now, in this incident, all the people who represented National Assembly, they came out, they gathered in the court of the Palace of Versailles and they took an oath that they were going to formulate a new constitution for France which will give France democracy, liberty and equal right. At least they promised that they will formulate a constitution which will allow the people of 3rd estate to fully participate in the administrative procedure of France. Now, National Assembly took control of the government. How did it happen? In 14 July, the representatives or the people who were revolting, those peasants and farmers who had gathered in France, they entered the prison of Bastille, and prison of Bastille was broken. Bastille was broken and the inmates were brought out. The President of National Assembly was chosen as the Mayor of Paris, and this is how National Assembly took the control of the government. Now, National Assembly brought certain changes. First of all, it published the document called Declaration of Right of Men and Citizen. Men and Citizen. Now, what did this document do? This document established the right of the people and it also abolished, now let me write, it abolished privileges, abolished privileges of the nobles, and also it abolished the church property, was also abolished. Okay, abolished or confiscated. Now, you must remember this National Assembly which was formed, let me write it, the National Assembly which was formed, it supported constitutional monarchy like the one we have in Britain. Okay? However, the Legislative Assembly which came into existence by the constitution that was created by National Assembly, that Legislative Assembly was dominated by left-wing Jacobins. Now, let me write because it might sound really confusing for you. Let me just bring it here, all the information. Now, National Assembly supported constitutional monarchy. According to National Assembly, the monarch was going to be the the head of the administration, but his power will just be nominal. It will not be the real power. Like today we have president at the head of the administration, but the real power is in the hand of Prime Minister and the cabinet. Similarly, constitutional monarchy is the form of government that today you see in Britain, where monarchy is just a tutelar head. So, this is what National Assembly wanted to do, but then National Assembly was the government which was formed, and then it created the Legislative Assembly. What is Legislative Assembly? The Parliament, right? In that Parliament, the power or the domination of power was in the hand of Jacobins. Now, these Jacobins were more radical. They wanted proper republicanism. They did not want the constitutional monarchy. What is republicanism? This is a very important question right now. What do you mean by republicanism? Republicanism is a state of government where the head of the administration is elected. So, India is a republic because our president is elected by Constituent Assembly, right? So, Jacobins wanted to remove monarchy and they wanted to establish a constitutional republican government in France. Now, what had happened during this time? How did the stage 2 of French Revolution came, where the power went into the hand of Jacobins? That is the main issue. Now, from 1792, the Legislative Assembly started working, but the problem was, even after being a constitutional monarchy, King Louis XVI continuously tried to interfere in the administrative work, especially in cases or in laws where the power of nobility and the privileges were being curbed. This was not liked by many people, and the next important event that happened was the formation of First Coalition. Now, what is this First Coalition? Countries like Prussia and Rome came together to attack France. Why? Because they were scared that if French Revolution would become successful, that would instigate the people in their country to revolt like the people revolted in France, and then throw the individual states or government of the respective country. That's why first coalition was formed against France was formed. Now, this had Rome and Prussia in the first coalition. So, let me write it down. Which were the country? Rome plus Prussia. Now, people in France, they mostly blamed the monarch for this coalition because they thought that it was monarch Louis XVI who was continuously communicating with these countries, and because the monarch was alive, these countries like Rome and Prussia, they formed a coalition to attack France and reinstate the monarch in the throne. Now, this is the reason why Jacobins became very, very powerful in the legislative assembly, and they started getting more support from the people. In 1792, the monarch was removed from the position of constitutional head in French legislature. Finally, in 1793, the monarch and his family, that is Louis XVI and his family, was seen escaping France, and they were brought back into Paris from the borders of France. In 1794, Louis XVI, the French monarch, was beheaded or guillotined. Now, this set an example because this was one of the most radical step, and in history it is also known as one of the most chaotic step taken by the left wing Jacobins. Obviously, soon after that Jacobins came into the power and the second stage of French Revolution began. The second stage of French Revolution began in 1793 when King Louis XVI was brought back from the borders of France, and then Jacobins came into the power. That group of National Assembly or the radical group of legislature was headed by a man called Maximilien Robespierre. Now, let me write his name. Jacobins took control of the government. Jacobins formed National Convention. The name of the government was National Convention National Convention, and their main goal was to create a constitution, create a republican form of constitution. One more thing you have to remember, during this time France was fighting its war against various coalition of European nations. All the European nations like Rome, Prussia, then Russia as well, they all came together, like Spain also was there. They all came together to fight against France so that they could destroy or they could curb the momentum of French Revolution and establish the monarchy in France again. So, this was the time when France was continuously fighting war with all these coalition all single-handedly. So, the Jacobins who formed the government, they were headed by a man called Maximilien Robespierre, and he brought a phase which is known as the reign of terror. Why? Because Maximilien Robespierre became an authoritarian ruler, or I should say an authoritarian administrator who would not allow any other parties or any other group of people to form an opinion. So, he started sending most of the people who were against his philosophy into the guillotine. Most of them were beheaded, beheaded or murdered or killed. Any opposition which people tried to put forth against Maximilian's rule, they were killed, murdered or put into prison. So, he started a phase which is famously known in France as Reign of Terror. Now, along with that, Maximilian also brought a new, new law in France, according to which every French citizen was forced to serve in army. This is known as conscription. Okay. So, Maximilian also introduced the law of conscription in France. Now, due to this changes, already French people were not very happy with Robespierre or the Jacobin club, because people were fighting for freedom, whereas Jacobins, what they brought was anarchy. Now, along with that, the last nail in the coffin was when Jacobins decided to raise the tax or increase the tax. Now, remember, French Revolution had started with the goal to stop the nobles from increasing further tax or imposing further tax on masses. When Maximilian tried to do the same, people obviously revolted. His reign was so much hated that Robespierre himself was brought into Paris and he was guillotined or beheaded in front of the crowd. Now, what happened after the death of Robespierre in 1795? The power went back into the hand of bourgeois class of France, who had formed earlier National Assembly. Now, these people came back and they formed another government or another administrative power, which was known as directorate. Now, this directorate, they tried to change whatever new clause were introduced in the constitution, which was formed by National Convention. So, what do you see? First, National Assembly. The constitution of National Assembly was changed by National Convention. Now, with the death of Robespierre, the constitution of National Convention is being changed by directorate. What did they do? The directorate did introduce a legislative assembly, but the executive was kept in a hand of few bourgeois class people who represented the nobility and the bourgeois section of French society, and these people were permanent. There was no concept of election as far as executive was concerned. Executive was not responsible to the legislative assembly. Now, let me write it down. What happened with the directorate? The directorates introduced a parliament. The parliament was changed after a duration of time, but parliament, the main function or the main law was made by an executive. This executive was known as directorate. Okay. Now, this executive was known as directorate, and this executive was permanent, and this executive was was also not responsible to the parliament. Now, what had happened ultimately, when you see the whole chain of event, the war or the revolution which had begun to change the authoritarian or autocratic regime of the monarch finally came into the hand of again an autocratic regime. Now, during this time, as I told you, there were many coalitions that were formed by various countries of Europe, which had Russia, Prussia, Rome, Spain, Britain and France were single-handedly fighting against all these coalitions. Due to this, the army became one of the major institutions of France, and people started looking up at army and the army officers. One of the most successful army officers of that time was obviously Napoleon Bonaparte. By 1799, people of France started supporting Napoleon Bonaparte, and they somehow had more more trust on Napoleon than the directorate, which was not going to bring democracy, which was not working to change the situation of France. In 1799, Napoleon came back to Paris and he usurped the power, and that was the end of French Revolution. In our other class, we will be discussing about Napoleon Bonaparte and what were the changes that he brought in the administration. I hope this class was helpful for you.